So I wanted to start out just quickly by thanking Dana and Rochelle and Tracy and everyone at the Mistakis Institute for hosting this gathering, and for all of you for taking the time to be here and be part of what I see as a really increasingly important conversation around the field of practice of citizen science. It's no small undertaking to put on an event like this, and absolutely no small undertaking to take the time here to be part of these conversations. So I'm really appreciative of all of the work that's gone into this. So again, my name is Jennifer Shirk. I'm here from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and I have a meandering history of about 20 years of experience in citizen science, from doing herpetology field research to a combination of herpetology, conservation, and education work, to more recent social science investigations of citizen science as a field of practice. And even though I am a herpetologist by training, I have somehow convinced the folks at the Lab of Ornithology to let me in the door, and feel incredibly blessed to be part of an institution that has such a long history of doing citizen science, and now has increasingly leveraged that to provide a lot of leeway to a small group of us there to really begin investigating how citizen science is done and to advance citizen science as a field of practice. And most currently, I'm involved in, as Dana mentioned, work to give birth to a citizen science association to really support and share best practices for practitioners in this field. But I am really not so much here to talk today about me and my interests as I am to engage a conversation around and with all of you about your interests, and to talk about pie. We'll do it this way. So just to start us off with a little bit of whimsy here this morning, back in, I think it was 2010, in an investigation of the field of citizen science at the Lab of Ornithology, we launched a survey that, while whimsical, had a serious intent, and that was to try to understand the diverse goals and interests that people were bringing to the field of citizen science. And we asked something along the lines of, if you are given a pie with 12 slices, how would you divide those slices up between 3 different goals? And I'm going to ask you that question here this morning. How many of you, we're not going to do the 12 slices, but let's just do it this way. How many of you would say that you have goals related to leveraging citizen science towards advancing scientific research? How about for education or outreach, public engagement? Okay, and conservation, stewardship, environmental management? All right. Yeah, I'm really not surprised, especially here in this room at this particular gathering, that goal of conservation management seemed to draw up the most hands, but really a lot of you I saw raised your hands across all 3 categories. And from that survey, which actually had a lot more statistical depth to it than what I'm going to show you here, we saw that those goals for citizen science projects were pretty evenly distributed. People really were interested in all 3 of those things at about equal weight. But I would actually wager that for many working, particularly in conservation fields, which is my background and my bias, so what I'm going to reflect a lot of here today, particularly for those working in conservation fields, citizen science is actually maybe more of a means of integrating those first 2 goals in service to the third, that of stewardship, conservation, and environmental behavior. Influencing environmental behavior. And I would argue that it's this integrated nature of citizen science that holds both the greatest promise and also offers the biggest challenges for the field of citizen science, not just for individual projects, but actually for the endeavor of citizen science itself. Because for citizen science to operate effectively, I'd suggest that it really takes a willingness to understand and engage both the science and the rigor of doing the science, as well as the social aspects and being willing to engage the needs and interests of the public in doing science collaboratively. And I'll say that this demands both disciplinary expertise and a willingness to engage across disciplines. And so when these insights come together, there is the opportunity to have a really transformative and powerful impact on such things as conservation as a measure of social scientific outcomes. But to do that can be really difficult. So to back up and to illustrate both the potential and some of the challenges, I want to share a story with you. And this is a story that I heard as part of my dissertation research, which was looking at and exploring the motivations of individual scientists who invested their careers, took risks, and engaged in citizen science despite potential challenges from their peers and colleagues about doing this work of inviting volunteers into the process of collecting their data. And this is a story of Jay Nichols, who is a scientist who's now based at the California Academy of Sciences. And he began researching the severely endangered black sea turtle in the 1980s. And at that point, the turtle's decline was due in part to overfishing. And where Jay was working in Baja, Mexico, on the western coast, turtle fishing had just been declared illegal. There was a need for basic research into where turtles were, how many were left, what they ate, what their decline looked like. And he found some successes in answering those questions. But in doing so, he reflected to me the following sentiment, which I'm suspecting may resonate with many in this room. Jay shared with me that, and I'm going to read a quote from him here, the idea that you collect data and then use that data to manage a species at risk or an ecosystem at risk, that makes sense. But, he said, I was realizing that that's certainly not enough. And not just not enough, but the connection between the science and conservation action is pretty weak. And he went on to say, something else needed to happen. And for Jay, that something else began through partnering with fishermen in Mexico. And in Baja at that time, those fishermen were referred to as turtle poachers because of a shift in the legality of hunting these turtles. And in those communities, though, those fishermen had boats, which Jay didn't have. Those fishermen had knowledge of where the turtles were. And those fishermen also had a cultural heritage and identity that were linked to the turtle populations. And by building these partnerships with individuals, with communities, and then throughout Baja California through a network called Grupo Tortuguero, which engages as well with management agencies and with university researchers, those communities now conduct regular monitoring of sea turtle populations throughout the coastal western Mexico region. And through this partnership, collaborating scientists have accessed the resulting data from that monitoring to publish scores of papers. Communities host sea turtle festivals and educational events. And harvesting and management practices for the turtles have both started to shift. And whether or not this is a result, the black sea turtle population has actually started to recover. So by all accounts and purposes, we can say that Jay has been involved in a successful citizen science initiative. A big part of the work that I've been doing over the past 10 or so years through the Lab of Ornithology has been to look across the range of citizen science projects to identify factors that contribute to success and try to understand how we measure and track and report and celebrate the success of citizen science in order to be able to produce the most effective research, education, and other social scientific impacts that we're interested in affecting. But there's a wide and growing diversity of citizen science projects out there. Many of us know that this field has really exploded over the past 10, 15 years. But at the same time, citizen science also has a really strong history and depth of tradition in fields that don't use that term. And so some of the work that I had been part of over the past few years has come up with this terminology that's being used as part of this conference today, public participation in scientific research, as a means of casting an umbrella across a wide range of traditions and types of projects that might help us explore important similarities in practice and the critical key differences that help make each individual project a unique success in its endeavors. I'm using the term citizen science today in part because of a shift across the field of practice to converge around this term. It also rolls off the tongue a little bit easier, so forgive me, but I'll cast out a definition for debate or consideration just to cast some lines around what we might be talking about today, even across these diverse traditions. And that is citizen science as intentional collaborations in which scientists engage with members of the public in the process of research to generate new knowledge. And that can be for a wide range of different purposes, and it also can be through a wide range of different approaches to that engagement between scientists and the public around the process of generating new knowledge through science. And so what does that process look like, and where are the opportunities for participation? So here, if we just accept for a moment that research looks like this, generally, if we talk about research writ large, most of these steps are undertaken by scientists, defining a question, gathering information, everything through collecting observations, analyzing the data, disseminating those data and results, and then iterating that process of asking questions. Citizen science may engage volunteers in any number of those steps in the scientific process. And as part of a report that was published in 2009 investigating the learning potential of different approaches to citizen science, there can be considered 3 different models. These aren't 3 codified models, but maybe 3 starting points for investigating different ways of how people participate and how that aligns with the likely learning outcomes they gain through their participation. So some projects may involve participants largely at the level of collecting data, maybe analyzing those data or samples. At the Lab of Ornithology, this is the approach that most of our projects have really built their success on. The fact that tens of thousands of bird watchers across North America have been keeping lists in shoeboxes for decades. And so how can we take advantage of those data points, that act of collecting data, to aggregate them into a single large database for a larger landscape scale question or questions? Some projects may involve participants a little bit more deeply in even analyzing and interpreting the data, and in some cases designing the protocols around data collection. And at the far end of a spectrum, if you want to accept that this is a spectrum of different approaches to citizen science, are projects where participants, and they may be individuals running their own scientific investigations, engage in the entire process of scientific research, everything from asking the question to collecting the data, making sense of those data, and sharing them with the wider community for some intended impact of that research. So there's a wide range of ways of participation and engagement for the public. Oftentimes, these engagement approaches also align with the scale of a project. So, for example, I mentioned our eBird project at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. On the left there, you'll see a map of eBird observations. Really just tens of thousands of observers, and now I think approaching millions of observations that are entered into that database. But the ability of anyone from our small eBird team to interact deeply or directly with members of the public is vastly limited by that issue of scale. But we might consider that people who are deeply engaged, whether it is in making observations and perhaps even advancing individual scientific inquiry through perhaps our bird sleuth curriculum at the Lab of Ornithology, where youth are engaged in asking their own questions around the eBird data set, investigating those data, and then making sense of those in order to take action in their communities, could result in a very different kind of meaningful experience for the participant. Because citizen science and the power of citizen science isn't just about observations, it really is about the impact of those experiences on the individuals who take part in them. And so how can we reconcile this issue of scale and issue of engagement when we're thinking about our projects and planning the type of interaction that we might want to have and facilitate with the volunteers that we're engaging? Just to put a little bit more of a boring picture on this, but to give you a perspective on some of the work that that you might be able to access that I've been involved in to define a logic model that underscores a wide range of citizen science projects. Project design is something that I've thought a lot about, along with colleagues from a wide range of institutions who were part of the PPSR report in 2009, and really thinking about the way that we consider the input of both the science and the needs of science and the needs and interests of volunteers, even when it comes to the level of identifying how a project is going to move forward, the question that is asked, and the way that those protocols and trainings are defined. All of those inputs and the balance between those interests will influence the way that a project infrastructure is developed, the types of observations and experiences that volunteer participants will have. And then I think there's a case to be made that there's a relationship between the way a project is designed based on those inputs and the types of outcomes that it's likely to achieve. So this model really suggests relationships. Some might say that this model suggests tensions between scientific outcomes and between outcomes for individuals, between data, research, and publications, and between access to information and learning. But what I'd like us to consider here today is how we might think about integrating those diverse interests from the outset of the design of a project in order not to look at tensions between those outcomes, but to look at synergies between those outcomes. How can we think about the relationship between science, the relationship between learning, and the way those things interplay in order to take action and to influence social ecological systems, whether that's legislation, whether that's relationships within communities, and how those things might move us inch us towards these larger unmeasurable things that we ultimately want to achieve, such as conservation, such as sustainability. And I mentioned before that there can be a tension between scales as well as we consider these things. But I want to just briefly reflect on a project that I still uphold as a model of integrating these goals and doing this process well to bridge both scientific and public interests and to bridge issues of large scale and local needs when it comes to data collection. And that's the example of the Canadian Community Monitoring Network. Was anyone here involved in this initiative a number of years ago? I'm sad to say that this was defunded a while back. But the thing that I found most powerful about this initiative and the work of Haig Vaughan and others through Environment Canada was the opportunity to leverage existing large-scale monitoring platforms where the protocols for data collection were already in place, the infrastructure for collecting and aggregating data across the country were already in place. And then going through an iterative process, going into communities and saying, not how do you want to use this project, but what's going on in your community? What are you concerned about? What are your interests and what keeps you up at night when you think about the environment in your area? And then going from there through a process of consensus building to look at how any one of these or other existing monitoring platforms might be leveraged to address the issues that the community was most concerned about. For example, in Hamilton, Ontario, one of the most key examples where this was implemented, there was a major concern about air quality. And using a lichen monitoring protocol and a large-scale database related to lichen, the community was actually able to go through the process of monitoring and identify several key areas where there actually were indications that air quality was a concern, and work with industry in the town to actually come to some mitigation related to that. No legislation was necessary, no litigation was necessary, just that social process of raising a concern, documenting a concern, and communicating about a concern, grounded in defensible data that really moved that issue forward to an effective end. Produced, and this is, I think, really key, what some in that group really talked about as not just rigorous or valid data, which is sometimes upheld as the gold standard terminology for citizen science, but timely data, data that were accessible to multiple groups, data that were relevant to concerns of multiple constituents, and data that ultimately were useful to address the concerns at hand. And I just want to come back again to this image for a moment. When we think about science and when we think about conservation, ultimately we might idealistically want conservation to really look and feel like this, right? We want to collect the data, we want to go out and make a difference, but we all know, I think through our experiences, that conservation and enacting conservation, and in fact enacting and working in most sciences these days really looks more like this. It's difficult and socially embedded work. And whether we want to save the world or save a single species or a place, no matter how rigorous or compelling the research, that research is surrounded by a social context of people and values and media and budgets and priorities that also ultimately influence decisions. And citizen science can be a powerful tool in these settings because it can engage both the social and the scientific aspects of problems. But how can we be sure to do both of those things well, both the science and the learning and the social aspect? In 2009, I think it was, I was part of a conference convened at the American Museum of Natural History in New York City, and actually Haig Vaughn from Environment Canada was there. And I'm not going to say too much about this particular event. There are proceedings available online if you're interested. There were some great insights that came out of it as to how citizen science can be used for conservation. But one funny tidbit that came out of our evaluation of the conference is this quote from a conservation scientist who said, in reflecting on the conference, "Even though it makes me uncomfortable, I'm thinking about ways to communicate or interact on a regular and frequent basis with the science education community." And I think that this quote is really telling in its honesty. That people engaged in this field really recognize that need to work cross-disciplinarily. They want to network, even people who find it uncomfortable. And so how can we make that possible? And how can we offer resources and venues to facilitate that networking and that kind of collaboration? But I want to remind us quickly that we need to slice into more than just one kind of pie when it comes to doing this work. This is more than just a binary distinction between science and education, between scientists, educators, conservation actors. This field can really benefit from engaging ideas across communities and areas of expertise of all sorts. And so let me ask, for example, how many here, slicing this pie a little bit differently, how many of us here are, for example, social scientists? Anyone here engaged in social science research? Okay, these folks are resources to you. Okay, how many are skilled in statistics or data management or data use? Not me, by any means. Otherwise involved in shaping policies, whether that's for conservation or for education. How many here are from industry or involved in technology development? You're it. Involved in watershed science? In astronomy? Oh, okay, so why astronomy? Is this an outlier here? For all of us, let me just share another quick anecdote. An ornithologist and an astronomer walk into a conference. This is a picture of a Karen Cooper, an ornithologist from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and Arfin Smith, who was, in 2012, at that time, the technical lead for the Zooniverse platform, which is well known for really bringing great rigor and attention to doing really important science that leverages crowdsourcing as a platform for curating data, for categorizing data, starting with galaxies, but then moving on to many other things. And so at the 2012 conference on public participation in scientific research, which took place in Portland, Oregon, Karen had a chance to sit down with Arfin, and by putting their heads together at that meeting, they hatched a plan to add thousands of the Lab of Ornithology's historic nest record cards. These are handwritten paper documents from the 1960s and even before, and use the newest Zooniverse platform at that time called Notes from Nature to really get those records transcribed and made usable and made accessible for scientists to finally be able to investigate nesting trends over time from these data that were locked up literally on that old school paper and pencil format. So then let's just look across these diverse fields of practices. I want to quickly share other kinds of unconventional collaborations that might be able to advance the field of citizen science. And three that I'm particularly familiar with, I'll just highlight very quickly. One is a partnership between colleagues Andrea Wiggins and Ann Bowser, who worked with data librarians and policy specialists through the Data One initiative to develop handbooks for data management is one, and for data policies is another. And I just want to say that this idea of managing and making useful data is really critical, not just looking at how data are collected, but then how they're managed and used so that they can become a historically useful data set moving forward. And I'm excited to hear later on this morning Dr. Beaubien show us some examples of how historical data sets can really be leveraged today to answer really critical policy questions. Another was a collaboration through the Association of Science and Technology Centers, working with educators and diversity specialists to produce a white paper exploring issues of equity and inclusion and diversity in citizen science. And this is a paper that shares 6 promising practices for the field through 11 case stories of organizations that have engaged this challenge in different settings. And they raise really important questions, such as how we can really productively talk about difficult issues such as citizenship, which is a term that conflates issues and concepts of nationality with concepts of engagement. And another talk this morning by Dr. Blue, I'm really looking forward to hearing her move that idea forward a little bit for us as well. And then Dana already mentioned that my colleague from the Lab of Ornithology, Tina Phillips, has been collaborating with educators, other evaluators, and psychometricians, this group of people I didn't even know existed, to produce not just this data evaluation user's guide, but also scales, user-friendly scales for evaluating learning outcomes of citizen science projects, and she'll be joining us later to talk a little bit about that. But there are many more issues that I know we will talk about here together, which include upholding high standards for science and for education. That's really critical. Providing policy-relevant insights, project sustainability, lots of ideas to think about and collaborate on together. Dana mentioned that I'm involved in a citizen science association, and I'll just quickly mention, because I think I'm running out of time, I thought I'd be short, it never happens, that the Citizen Science Association is really in the formative stages, but 3 things that it's pushing forward if you're looking to engage after leaving here are the following. Especially engaging across this diverse field, which is always a challenge. One is providing a website that really reflects the diversity of this field. And this is the new look and feel for the website I've been most deeply involved in, citizenscience.org. It's not yet launched. You can see we're still in lorem ipsum. But this really tries to show visually that it's not just birds, it's not just conservation, and also actively as infrastructure invites contributions from everyone who has really important guides, insights, resources to share across this field. Another is a journal, and this is a demonstration of all of the publications in ISI Web that have acknowledged being about citizen science. Not all acknowledge that. And the blue are actually disciplinary outcomes. The orange are projects that are about citizen science, how it works, what the practice is about. And those are locked up in many cases in disciplinary specific journals and maybe not useful to those of us who are trying to learn across this field. And also, some could argue, taking up space that those blue publications could be using in that disciplinary journal where they should be publishing the research from citizen science. So we're moving forward with an open access journal on theory and practice specifically. And then finally, upcoming in February in conjunction with the American Association for the Advancement of Science, which is across all scientific disciplines, we'll be hosting a conference in San Jose, California. If you're interested in coming to another conference and want to share your ideas, abstracts for proposals are due Monday. a week from yesterday. Even if you can't come, we're also looking for reviewers for those proposals and would invite anybody here to be involved in that process. But I would say those are all work that's happening under Global Skies, but there's a real merit, and I think it's incredibly powerful, the idea that Dana and others are proposing of a regional hub. So what can we do and talk about and move forward under Western Skies here? Whether that's leveraging existing platforms, not recreating the wheel in designing a new project when there's technology that you might be able to use and collaborate with. That can help avoid keeping data apart that might be better used in aggregate, whether that's taxonomic specific data or data across taxa. What does water quality maybe have to do with fish species, for example? How can we learn together through research? And other issues that I hope we engage throughout our conversations here today, that we really can move forward, both under Global Skies and probably more productively at the local level. So I'm gonna